Hello and welcome to Enta Asks Live. We are very excited here today. My name is Adam Colazetti. I am the co-founder of Enta Solutions, and we have my co-partner,
I'm Caitlin Bullock.
and we have Ben Baker with us. Ben, say hello.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here.
And tell us a little bit about yourself, Ben.
Yeah, so let's just start off, a little bit about me. I come from the communication industry over the last 25 years. I started off killing trees about 25 years ago, lots of them. I was in the direct mail business. We used to do million piece runs for the casino industry, the grocery industry, and a few other industries. And what I seem to understand is it was very reactive. People were just sending out information and hoping for the best. There wasn't a lot of strategy. There wasn't a lot of brand involved in it. There wasn't a lot of, figuring out about what was going to work better. They just wanted to react. And that was the first thing that I needed to get my clients to understand is that we need to sit there and understand why we're sending out information. Who are we sending it out to? Why do they care? What do we want them to do? And that's where I started in the communication business. And through that area, I've gone through direct mail. I've been involved in promotional marketing. I've been involved in trade show consulting, social media marketing, email marketing, you name it. But the one thing that is consistent throughout the years is brand. And I've always been involved in sitting there going, understanding of what is your brand? Who are you? Why do people care? Because if people don't care about you, you're just another commodity. You're just somebody that's easily replaced, easily forgotten, and just another number out there. And when you can understand what your brand is and you can communicate it effectively, you are far more resilient in any market. Now, I am the author of two different books. One is called Powerful Personal Brands that I wrote in 2018. The second book just came out during COVID, and it's called Leading Beyond a Crisis. I've been a podcaster for years, and I have a program called Podcast Host for Hire. And what Podcast Host for Hire does is we create, distribute, produce, and even voice B2B podcasts for large to enterprise companies that are sitting there going, we know we need a podcast, we know we need to communicate, but we have no idea where to begin. And we had no idea how to do this successfully. So we take over the entire process and either be the voice for it, or we train the person inside the office how to be that effective voice and communicate their message internally and externally. So that's a little bit about me.
So I really like, you touched on personal brand and how it's important. People need to care about who you are for you to be successful. And that's true. If you have an organization within the organization with your people, as well as outside with your community, with your potential clients. So maybe we'll just start internally. So, I have a big company. I've got lots of people. Maybe I have a bunch of locations. Communication is tricky. How do I make sure that my culture, my brand, my decisions are communicating to my people, especially during tough times?
Yeah, because if we can't communicate our vision, our purpose, our raison d'etre, our reason for being internally, we'll never be able to communicate it effectively externally. If your people don't drink the Kool-Aid, if they don't believe in if they don't understand where you are and where you're going, you'll never be able to convince people externally, because as soon as you send that marketing out and people start engaging with your internal people, and if your internal people are not drinking the Kool-Aid and they're not walking the walk and as well as talking the talk, people get confused very simply. So the one thing I tell people is we need to get rid of the mission, vision, value statements of organizations. And I'll tell you why. People don't remember them. People don't live them. I've been part of that organization. I've been the one that's taken people to that really nice resort on a hill somewhere, with the 2 half days of golf and the 2 half days of actually working on those mission, vision, value statements, walk back with this wonderful, document, and they put it up on a board somewhere and they talk about it once and then they forget about it. And it's not the way they live, and it's not the way they make decisions, and it's certainly not the way they onboard and treat their employees. Instead, what we need to do is create a brand story. As people, as human beings, we've been telling stories to each other for tens of thousands of years. Before we could write anything down, we had oral history. And those oral histories allow us to not only listen to them, but internalize them. To be able to reach and recall these things, tell them in our own language, and be able to perpetuate them. So if every employee understands your brand story, where did you start out with? What's the genesis of the company? Why did you start it? Where are you today? What are the challenges and successes that brought you from that original point to today? Who do you serve? Why do you serve them? Why do these people care? What's the value you bring to the world? And how do you solve problems? What are the things that are important to you, and what are the things that aren't important to you? And more importantly, where are you going? If we can do that effectively in a story format, we'll be able to perpetuate and live it, and all decisions end up coming from that story, and the company brand and purpose builds.
So I really like this idea of the story, right? Because storytelling is memorable, and it's entertaining, and it's engaging, and then, your purpose, mission, vision, values, whatever can fall out of that, like they're in there. But I guess my question is, I think organizations do two things wrong when they create these vision statements or whatever, because they can be powerful tools, but I think what happens is the leadership creates them without the involvement of people in some fashion. Now, granted, whether it's filling out a survey or whatever. And then two, once they're created, like you said, they announce them, they check the box, then they move on. It's not like it's actually shows up in multiple cascading ways of communication. It's not in your email signature. It's not like a mouse pad on your desk. It's not a poster on the wall. It's not like every time there's a procedure, like these three values are highlighted. Like it kind of shows up once and fizzles. So storytelling is another way of communicating, but how do you do it so that the same thing doesn't happen?
And I think that's important. It's perpetuating the brand. It is making sure that brand purpose and that brand story is everywhere within the company. You're right. It can't just be a dictum from up high. It can't be a small group of people within the C-suite that come up with this and just try to dictate it from below, to below, and then not live it. The C-suite has to live it. They have to live the brand values. They have to believe in it, and they have to talk about it on an ongoing basis. Be able to sit there and say, we made these decisions. We're buying this new piece of equipment. We're bringing this new vendor on because it aligns with our mission and our purpose. And that comes down to people understanding what those are within the brand story. The other part of it is you're right. We need to be able to have people within the organization to not only be part of creating this brand story, but perpetuating it. And it means that leaders at all levels, and I want to get rid of the term manager, and I want to call them first tier leaders, because there's a big difference between managing process and leading people. And if people are leaders and they sit there and say, how do I lead my team effectively? How do I make sure that they're effective? How do I make sure that they're engaged? How do I make sure they understand the purpose and they understand that what they do matters? I'm going to use that brand story in order to be able to do that, because when people inside the company, when people at the front line understand the brand story and they understand why it matters to them, and they understand how what they do is important to perpetuate the success, they're going to work harder. It's all about why. People want to know, why am I doing this? Why should I care about this? Why do I need to do this instead of that? Well, you need to do this because it's part of the brand story. It's part of who we are. And it's sitting there letting people milk it in, make it part of their DNA. Because if people at all levels can make this part of their DNA, they're going to care about it. They're going to reach and they're going to recall it. They're going to tell it to others, and they're going to say, wait a second, why are we doing this? It's not part of who we are. And that leads to better decisions throughout the whole organization.
Yeah, that's so true. So, okay, so I'm going to ask you like the biggest conundrum here, Ben. So I was out doing a social distance meeting hike, right? And I walked past this big truck that's, they're one of the trail maintenance guys. And and then I walked past the sign, and he goes, hey, you can't go down that trail. That's for like the cross country skiers. He's like, did you see the sign? And I was like, yeah, I saw the sign. I'm like, I didn't read it. Okay. He's like, okay. He goes, I'm struggling with this problem. How do we better communicate? And I looked at him and I couldn't give him a good answer. And like for people, and I know leaders often say, well, we sent it in an email, we put it up on the lunch board. Like, how do we make sure it's effective? What do we do?
Communication can't just be one way. I love this conundrum. I truly love this conundrum because you hear this every single day. I told my people about this. I put it in a memo. I sent out an email. Why don't people understand this? The problem is we need to communicate in the language of the people that we are talking to. And we need to verify that they actually understand it. Communication just can't be a one-way, process. It has to be, I said this. Did they understand it? Do they understand what it means to them? Do they understand what I need them to do? Check, 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 check. Great. Now we move forward. And then a little while later, it's just going, how are we doing? Do you need any help? Is there anything that's going on? Is there something that's come up that's kept us from being able to move forward? Okay, check, 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 check. Go on and say, and then the next step, and then the next step. Because the problem is people need to feel reinforced. They don't need to be micromanaged, but they need to make sure that, hey, as a leader, they're there if we need them. If we need them, they're there. It's like making sure that life jacket that you keep at the bottom of the canoe, it's there when you need it. You don't really want to wear it. You really don't want it, encumbering you when you're trying to, paddle. But you certainly want to make sure if that canoe dumps, that life jacket is right here where you can grab it really quick. And I think that a lot of people need to think about that in terms of leadership style, is to be able to sit there and say, listen, I'm here for you. How can I help you be successful? You tell me what you need to be successful. You tell me what it's going to take in order for us as an organization, as a team, as a division or whatever, to be able to accomplish this goals. Okay, you individual people, you know what to do. I trust you. I hired you. I believe in you. Go do what you need to do, but let's check in and make sure we're all on the same page. And who needs help? Who doesn't get this? Okay, great. Refocus, rescrum, talk about it, figure it out together. Okay, everybody break apart and come back together if we have another problem, or check in on a regular basis. It's not about talking one way.
Sorry, no, excuse me. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'd say that's a great observation and somewhat altruistic. Meaning it takes a true business leader who is confident in themselves and skills to actually open up and have that collaborative dialogue with their people. It's been my experience that there's still a lot of the command and control, top down, and a lot of egos. Right? Why would I ask my underlings about their opinion? Because I know, and therefore it shall be done.
Well,
real simple to that. Can I just answer that?
Sure.
Is that here's the thing: every employee that you lose costs you $100,000 to replace, if not more. A senior executive loss could be 2.5 to 3 times their overall compensation. 70% of employees today, and this is pre-COVID numbers, were unengaged in one way, shape, or the office, and that means just not either caring about what they're doing or actually out there looking for a job. And 50% of people are actually out there looking for a job today. So if we're not sitting there and realizing that our people are the most important thing, if we're not willing to change as leaders, we're going to be spending an enormous amount of time backfilling channels and getting new people, getting them up and trying to train them up and trying to get them organized and trying to rebuild what we've already had, only to lose them again because of that command and control lifestyle. People today, and I don't care if we're talking about Gen Zs all the way to the Gen Xs and the boomers that are still in the marketplace, don't want to be micromanaged. They want to sit there and they want to understand that what they do has purpose and that there's reason for what they do. And if we can't, as leaders, understand that and move beyond our own egos and sit there and say, this is a team that needs to succeed, we're just going to keep getting what we always got. and that's frustration and a lot of missed opportunity.
Well, I really like, what you said about, cascading messages. Because if you have this mindset and you're kind of trying to change to that, you need to tell people, right? And the best two pieces of advice I ever read about communicating was one, different messages, which we talked about. The second was over communicate the heck out of it. So did you send an email? Yes. Good. Send 10 more, make 20 posters, right? Like, and then repeat it, albeit in different ways, right? So, it's kind of the power of the exponential, which I think is where the podcast can come in, right? Because
Oh, yeah.
now you can have a conversation. So if you have a company that's trying to communicate internally, you're going to do a podcast. What's your first step? What's your first episode going to be about?
Well, let me just talk about that first before I get into the podcast. Because it's a great point that you make, is that, they used to say, a commercial is totally ignored until you've heard it 7 times. Until you see something 7 times, until it's put in front of you, and that number could be 12 now, it could be 20 now, because we're seeing so much more information. We're so inundated with information out there that a lot of stuff just goes in one ear and out the other. And you're right, communicating across different platforms in different ways, I learn differently than you learn differently, than Greg learns differently, than Kate learns differently. And being able to communicate in different ways that are going to resonate with different people. I may get the podcast where somebody else gets a written word, where somebody else wants a one-on-one conversation. So we need to work on that. A podcast, your first episode is one of two things. It either sets it up. Your first episode is usually a shorter episode, usually under 10 minutes, that sets up why are we doing this? This is what the podcast is going to be about. This is who I am, or this is who the podcast hosts are. This is why we created the podcast, and these are the type of things that we're looking to accomplish over the next year or 2 years. And why are we doing this? And that's the first episode. The other method is save that to the second episode and have an absolutely stellar guest as episode number 1. So if you've got the ability to have the CEO of the organization, a big name speaker, somebody who's important within your industry, that's just going to set the stage perfectly, sometimes that's the great first episode. And then the second episode is, by the way, here's who we are, this is what we do, this is why we're doing it, and this is where we're going. So there's 2 different, trains of thought. I've done both. Both are successful. It all depends on what your vision is for your podcast.
That's really interesting. So now you've got it kind of established. Now you've got some dialogue. When you're talking with your people, do you start with people at the top, or do you start with people doing the work, or do you kind of make a mix of interviewing or different combinations? Like, what have you found kind of works as a good strategy for your internal guests on your show?
Well, when we're dealing with internal guests on a show, you want to have a mixture. If you're having a podcast, say you have a multinational company, you have offices in a variety of different countries, across 5 or 6 or 8 different product lines, etc. You want to be very careful about how you're laying it out in the strategy, because what you're trying to do with an internal podcast is get people to have better insights about what's happening, beyond their line of sight, and see what's going on. And usually what you'll do is you'll start off with a vision, a macro vision, and then work your way down. So you may talk to the senior management, all the way across. So what you may start with the CEO or the founder and get their vision of what they think is going on. Then talk to the various divisions and find out a little bit more about the divisions, and then start cascading it down. Start talking about different products. Start talking about different challenges. Talking about how different departments interrelate. Talk about when we take this product from here and we move it from the Atlanta plant to the LA plant. What are the challenges that we're having when we're receiving this thing, and how would it make it easier for us to be able to be more successful moving forward? And have that little thing, and not as a figure pointing, but to sit there and say, These are the things that we found have been best practices within our plant that have made us more successful. And then talk to the other plants and maybe bring them in on 5 or 6 different people on a podcast to be able to talk about amongst different divisions. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. It depends on the size of the company, depends on what are you guys trying to achieve, and what are the things that are the hot buttons right then and there. Because you really need to be timely. When you're creating a podcast, you want to be timely and you want to be able to have it communicate what are the challenges that you're facing right now, or what are the opportunities that you're facing right now, and how do you move either through them or have everybody embrace them.
Greg, did you have a question?
Yeah, just curious. I like what you're saying, Ben. But is it when you're doing an internal podcast, is there any you said it depends on the company size and such, but is there any stats or anything telling you what is more effective, whether you have a talking head, the talking leader just telling the story versus the interview style? Is there anyone that's you have an opinion on as to what is more effective?
I'm more of an opinion that talking heads don't last very long. For a couple different reasons. If you're a talking head, especially if you're a CEO of an organization, you're busy. And you don't have the time as a CEO to dedicate every single week to be able to put something out. Because if you're going to do a podcast, you want to make sure that every Wednesday at 10 o'clock, that podcast goes out. Hell or high water. Because it's a consistency that enables people to actually see the benefit of it. Now, if you're doing this as an interview style, it allows to have that host interview a wide variety of people and be able to enable those people to tell their story in an effective way without bias. And having that curiosity of a third party questioning you, first of all, enables people to relax. The conversation tends to be a lot easier when it's a conversation versus me standing up trying to do a podcast in front of a camera. You tend to relax a lot more, you tend to be a lot more fluid, and you tend to be able to make sure the key points are covered. Where if you're trying to do this on your own, you may not cover all the points you want to have. So that's my viewpoint. Some people actually love it. Some people actually want to be that talking head. The question is, do your people want to hear a talking head every single week?
That's really interesting.
So you touched on.
Oh, sorry. Greg, do you have another follow-up question?
Yeah, I do.
Go for it.
Basically, it's you just touched on it and about feeling more comfortable about standing in front of a camera or not. So, is there, when you're talking about just the of doing podcasts, that do you do a lot of a video podcasts going through, or do you take the video podcast interview and then take the audio portion and put it into a podcast style? Or it may be too deep into the tactics and the weeds, but it's my question.
Let's talk about this very quickly. What we do is we'll record the video, but the video tends to be cut up into small little bite-sized pieces, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5-minute pieces that can be shared, either on a web page or an email or whatever, that talk about one salient point. Nobody really wants to watch a 35 or 60-minute video. People will listen to a 35 or 60-minute podcast if it's interesting, if it's engaging, if it's relevant, while they're in the car, while they're on a run, while they're on a hike, late at night or whatever. They will do that in an audio format, but they won't sit there and watch a 30 to 60-minute video. So the video is good to be used as a secondary source. And that's the beautiful thing about podcasts, is it creates a wide variety of content that can be shared across mediums by taking the original podcast and turning it into everything from articles to blog posts to audiograms to video to it's Instagram pictures, all sorts of things, tweets. You can do all that kind of stuff when you have the podcast because you've got 30 to 60 minutes worth of information that can be cut up and repurposed.
Okay.
Yeah. Taryn, did you have a question? I thought I saw.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the insights, Ben. I want to ask that with so much of podcast and so much of digital media and everything in the market as of now, how should we keep ourselves unique so that we can actually focus on and remember those things as a customer? Yeah, because there's so much of tons of information overload, I believe. And once we, I would say, cross or drive 1 kilometers on the road, there are 15 hoardings. It's difficult to remember what you saw on the first hoarding by the time you reach the 15th one.
Yeah. Well, the first thing we need to remember is 2 years ago in 2018, there was 500,000 podcasts. Today, there's over 1 million. Okay, there's 1 million podcasts out there, but here's a bigger stat. 70% of those podcasts never make it to 10 episodes. They die. And the reason they die is people don't have a purpose behind them. They don't have a strategy. They don't understand the process of building a podcast effectively. It's hard. They don't see the quick win. So what makes a podcast great is the fact that you realize you have a niche audience. You're not, unless you're a Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan, you're not speaking to millions of people. You're sitting there going, this is my audience. My audience looks like this. I sit there and I picture somebody, okay, if my audience is someone like Caitlin, I'm picturing what Caitlin does. What does she, what does she care about? What are important to her? When does she listen to this? What, how much time is she going to want to spend doing this? What are the things that are hot buttons for her? How are we going to make her life better? And that's how you create a podcast. You sit there and say, this is my audience. You're not aiming at 7.5 billion people. You're aiming at 500, 1,000, 2,000, but you're really aiming at one. And you're sitting there going, these are the people that are going to care about me. So I need to create a podcast that is absolutely dedicated to these people. We're going to talk about these things. We're going to talk about it at the best, most relevant way that we can, and give these people the most insights that you can. And you need to be listening. You need to give them, your audience a way to get back to you and give you feedback and give you comments and say, hey, I like this, but I didn't like this. I wanted to listen to a guest like this. Could you cover this subject? All those type of things, and be able to listen to all that and make the podcast better. So it's always about improving. It's always about listening. It's all about realizing that your podcast will get larger because people, it's the Seth Godin thing. People like us do things like this. And if you find your niche audience, you find those minimal viable audience that love what you do, they'll start recommending your podcast to other people, and they'll recommend your podcast to other people. And that's how it'll grow, because they're all people that think that, have similar ideas and similar thoughts and similar challenges.
Makes sense. So I believe then consistency is the key. As you mentioned, that 70% of them lose out. So consistency and having great content regularly.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm 200 and whatever episodes into my main podcast. When I started this out and you listen to my first 10 podcasts, I didn't know what I was doing. I honestly didn't. My first 10 podcasts are probably terrible if you go back and you listen to them. But as you get better and you do this more and you build a muscle, it's like working out. You're building a muscle every year, every week. You're building new muscles on this. And you get better, and your questioning gets better, and you listen more intently, and you care more about your guest, and you care more about your audience because you're more invested. And that's what makes a podcast better.
So it's probably a good thing you don't have like 100,000 followers on your very first episode of podcast, because
Where would you go from there?
Well, okay, so you were podcasting before it was cool.
Yes.
Okay. So now that podcasting is like so popular, and you don't know how many business leaders are going, I wonder if I should start a podcast. Is this the right marketing strategy for me? Like, is this the right thing for my brand? And what is the right choice between going on the circuit or taking the effort and time to create? What's the differentiator there to help leaders decide what's the right path for them?
I suggest anybody who's thinking about a podcast, go get on 10 or 15 podcasts. Go find 10 or 15 podcasts that you like, that you respect, that you're interested in, and try to become a guest on those podcasts. You are going to learn so much, about yourself, about different people's podcasting styles. You're going to find out what you like, what you don't like. different equipment, different ideas, different things, and be able to do that before you invest the time and the energy to create your own podcast. Look and see what other people are doing. Look at the people that have been successful, and try not to get on the podcast of people who've done 10 episodes. Try to get on the podcast of people who've done 50, 75, 100 episodes. And that's important, because if you look at people who've done over 50 episodes, they've kind of figured something out. They may not be perfect. They're going to get better. I'm over 200 episodes. When I'm at 400, my shows are going to be way better than they are today. And when I'm at 1,000 episodes, my shows will be even better still. But what it allows you to do is, when you first go out, to sit there going, do I like doing this? Do I actually like doing this? I mean, I was on podcasts for 3 or 4 years before I even started my own. And, and finally somebody came up to me and said, Ben, you're a really good guest. You should have your own podcast. And, it took me about 6 months from that period of time to actually convince myself that I actually had enough to talk about on a weekly basis, that this was a reason to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think, that can be one of the challenges too, is, it's intimidating. Oh my God, I got to come up with content every week, right? So, but I think there is a bit of a fallacy out there that you have to like craft this like amazing message every week, versus, just talk about what happened in your business this week if you want, right? People like real stories, like, holy smokes, this week, this and this happened, and this is how I solved it, and what do you think, or whatever, right? So is there some like advice when people are starting out? Do you just tell them, just start, or do you give them, when you meet with a company and then they're going to broadcast their podcast externally, do you kind of give them, hey, here's your plan for your first 10, and after that you'll be on a roll? Like, what?
I'm a big believer of, you have to be passionate about what you're doing. Like, for me to talk about accounting would just be dumb. I don't care about accounting. I have an accountant that does it. I don't want to talk about accounting unless I bring somebody in who's talking about finance within the company. Then I'm going to be asking them questions to be able to get their insights. But I'm a big believer of, you need to know what your first 10, 15, 20 episodes are going to be, depending on what your level of comfort is. Because if you start planning it out and sit there and say, okay, here's where we're going, and it may not be the perfect 15 or perfect 20 episodes, but this is where we want to go. These are the type of people we want to get on the show. This is why we want to have them on the show. This is what we want to talk about. This is the direction we're going to go. This is, why people are going to listen to us. It makes life a lot easier. And people say, okay, I started a podcast because I like to talk. Well, that's not a good enough reason to start a podcast. Podcasting is tough. The easiest thing about podcasting is being on the mic. It truly is. Finding the right guests, scheduling it, making sure you've got all the artwork, building the show itself, the strategy behind the show, editing the show properly so it edits both for content and also for length, making sure that it's produced effectively, make sure that it's distributed properly, make sure that it's marketed effectively. All that is the stuff about podcasts that most people never even think about when they're creating a podcast. So you really need to understand what's involved in the process. And am I willing to commit to this either as an individual or as a company? What do I want to do? What do I want to outsource? What do I want to afford? What are my goals for doing this? What do we want to achieve by doing this podcast? Are we looking for new clients? Is this a branding thing? Is this a name recognition piece? Why are we starting this podcast, and what do we want it to do for us? So when you have all that in mind, you're better off.
So Ben, I have a question. When my company, we do a lot of videos, editing, and interviews and such. And kind of as a rule of thumb, for when we do a video interview, say it's a 10, 15-minute interview, we usually spends about at least 4 hours of editing time, just getting it ready for go, let alone the distribution and social media and all that stuff. So do you kind of have a ratio number in terms of prep time versus mic time?
I would say that 4 to 1 is probably, a pretty good, thing. Everything from, you know, building the strategy for that show, any research you may have to do on the person, the pre-interview with the person to make sure that you're all on the same page, post-show editing. I just had a show, the other week where I've recorded it. I'm going to probably have to spend 2 hours just in listening to it to do the rough edits down so I can give it to my team and say, look, you got to get rid of this, you got to get rid of this, you got to get rid of this, because this person just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked about superfluous stuff, and you couldn't get them to get to the point. So it's a matter of sitting down there, and every episode is different. I have episodes that I have literally just let go. I've just sat there and say, you know what? That was perfect. That was 35 tight minutes of great conversation. You know what? There's a little, superfluous here and there, but for 3 seconds here and 2 seconds there, I don't care. Just let it go. But there are episodes that could take 2.5 hours just in rough editing, just listen to it back and forth, deciding what are you going to keep and what are you not going to keep. So it really depends on the guest. It depends on the episode. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve too.
And I would say, I think something that a lot of people want to achieve about it, or at least hesitant about, is I want more leads, right? I'm going to start a podcast. I'm going to do videos, whatever, because I want more leads. And I know that, in Caitlin and I's case, we do a lot of videos, we do a lot of talking. And like you said, it comes from consistency, it comes from being genuine, and basically also being kind of interesting, right? I can't tell me how many times I've met somebody for the very first time and they've said, oh, by the way, say hi to Caitlin for me. And I'm like, oh, Caitlin? They're like, no, I watched your videos. Right? So, as seen on TV. So, okay, now we got this podcast. You've got your outline of kind of 20 conversations you want to have. So who do you reach out to? Do you reach out to, suppliers, to clients, to people in the community, maybe even competitors? Like, where do you find these guests?
It really depends on the show. Let's take this as a B2B corporate show.
Okay.
Because there's a million types of shows out there. But let's take a B2B corporate show. I tell people that your 4 main sources of guests are employees, vendors, customers, and strategic partners. Those are your 4 main, sources of information. Now you can sit there and say, wait a second, there's a new technology on the marketplace. We don't know anything about this. I know it's going to affect my customers. Let's go find an expert on that. There's, this challenge is happening in the market. This is, we're running into this particular issue. We're having issues with this. If we're having issues with this, our clients are probably having an issue with this. Let's bring in an expert in this particular field to be able to talk about that and be able to bring that stuff up, because your best sources are people, first of all, like, and trust. The beautiful thing about bringing in vendors is you can sit there and say, what are the new things? What are the things that you're working on that we're not seeing with other customers? What are the things that we should be paying attention to that, that you haven't brought to our attention yet at this point in time? What are some challenges that you're seeing in the marketplace that we may not be seeing? With your customers, you can find out an enormous amount of information. You interview them about their company. You let them talk for 20, 25 minutes about their company, what they do, who they are, their customers, their challenges, their successes, all that kind of stuff. And the next thing that you ask them at the last 2 questions are, what are the things that, we've had a really strong relationship for a number of years. What are the things we do really well for you? And what are the things you'd love us to do that we're not currently doing for you? And then you shut up and you let them talk. And that's a powerful thing to be able to do, because what you've already done is you've built that, that level of trust and that open communication over 25 minutes. Now you can let them talk, and you're going to gain some insights that are going to be incredible that you may never get otherwise.
One question around this, hang on. So when a company does a communication, right, there might go like through a 3-tier review process before that a communication can go external. Mm-hmm. When you're doing a podcast, like, that's your clip. Like, you're not doing it live, so it's pre-recorded. So you can cut some stuff out, but at the end of the day, you need to keep enough content. So what do you do if, how do you prep somebody to get the right stuff out and not say the wrong thing?
It really depends. I mean, I've had companies that legal, unfortunately, reviews every single episode before it goes out, and that's reality. You have sometimes where you have certain companies that want to sit there and go, wait a second here, we can't announce that yet. That's controversial. This is that. And you need to let people know that at the beginning. I mean, when I'm interviewing people, it says, was there anything within the interview that you want cut? And then let's talk about it. Why do you want it cut? Okay, let's sit down and talk about it. Okay, can we sit there and re-talk about this so I can edit this in? Can we talk about it without talking about it? And be able to have those conversations. And that might mean, and then, coming back and putting an additional piece together, or it might be at the end of the interview, listen, do you have 5 more minutes? I just want to go over this one piece so we can do that in such a way that we're not going to get into legal trouble. We're not going to let a cat out of the bag or whatever. But it's a matter of letting your audience know, and the people you're interviewing know that, whatever you're saying here on tape, if there's something that you're not comfortable with, let me know so we can get that out of there ahead of time.
Right.
And then it comes down to creative editing. Then it comes down to creative editing. Yeah. I mean, what I've done is I've sat there and said, okay, customers talked about this. Wait a second, we can't talk about it. So what I'll do is I'll put in a 2 or 3 minute conversation from my point of view where I summarize what they talked about without talking about that specific point. So instead of them having to come back and talk about it, I'll just say, you know what, this is a really interesting point. I'm sure you agree with that, and then edit that into whatever, the next conversation that's coming out.
Right.
So, become that syllabus for the conversation without having to, let all the cat out of the bag unnecessarily.
Well, and I guess that's where really the value of someone like yourself comes in, right? Because there's a process to this. You can kind of stumble through it on your own, right, and make those mistakes. Or you can kind of ask somebody to coach you through it the first time, right? Now, we talked about internal podcasts and kind of external podcasts. Have you worked with anybody that has both? And if you have, how do they balance those? Do they have 2 separate ones, or is it the same one? What do they do?
I haven't run it. People that are doing an internal podcast are not putting it on Spotify and iHeart and and iTunes or wherever they're putting it. They're really running it through their intranet. Because they really want that information to be housed internally. You do have companies that sit there and say, you know what, this information is good for my, not only for my internal audience, but it's external audience, and develop the podcast with that thought process in mind. It really comes down to, I haven't done this, but you would create the podcast with say, listen, the information that we're creating is not only for internal consumption, but it's for external as well. So let's talk based on that. Let's base the information on that. And what you may do is have some internal segments that you just release internally, and have certain elements that you only release externally. So there's different ways of doing it. It really comes down to strategy. It comes down to what are you trying to achieve. And it can be tricky or it can be easy depending on the company and who you're interviewing, and being able to set the ground rules at the beginning of the conversation.
Greg, did you have a question?
I do, Ben. So you mentioned the fact that there was, when it first started, there's a 250,000 podcasts. Now there's well over 1 million podcasts that are out there. So there's a lot out there. There's a lot of noise. And there's a lot of time and effort and money that goes into getting these things set up. So my question for you is around the monetization of podcasts, meaning, or what have you seen for models out there that people are either getting sponsors to pay or guests are on a pay to play basis? Where are you seeing? I'd say the majority are not, they're not monetized, but the ones that are, what are you seeing? What's working out there?
Well, it all depends on what you determine as monetization. Like for my podcast, my guests are potential clients. I choose my guests for my show. Either I feel that they could be a potential client, or they could introduce me to people within their network that could be potential clients. So for me, it's a marketing piece. It is, the ROI comes with the long tail, realizing that, if I've gotten a half dozen clients a year off my podcast through the know, like, and trust, what you're going to be able to do it. A buddy of mine had a podcast. He was desperately trying to get in front of a customer. And this guy was ducking him. So he went and he created a podcast about a specific issue that he knew that this customer had, and how they were going to solve it. And what he did is he got a buddy of his who was friends with the CEO of this company that he was trying to get a hold of, to say, hey, listen, you got to listen to this podcast. It's right on an issue that you have a hot spot on right now. The CEO talked about it and then called my buddy who was running the podcast. So there's different ways to monetize a podcast. You're right. There's sponsorship. There is pay to play. The problem with pay to play is all of a sudden you're stuck, having to serve the agenda of the person that is paying to be on your podcast. It's like conferences that say, if you want to speak to my audience, you have to pay $5,000 to be a speaker at my conference. Well, guess what? All of a sudden you're getting a 30, 60, or 90-minute infomercial. That's what you're going to get. If you're doing the pay to play, all you're going to be doing is you're going to be getting an infomercial. If that's what you want, if you want to give people, an ability to create their own infomercials, and that's the type of podcast you want to have, fill your boots, go for it. Charge people $500 to $1,000, whatever you charge them. They come on your podcast, they get to tell their story, they get to sell their wares, and you're $1,000 richer, or $2,000 richer, or $5,000 richer every time somebody does it. Hey, that's great, but that's a different type of podcast. If you're looking at monetizing in terms of either sponsorship or being able to have actually have advertisers, those are two different animals. Sponsors are there because they sit there and say, okay, we think that there's benefit of doing this in terms of brand recognition. Somebody is sitting there going, there's reason for us to be aligned with this podcast, and we're going to do this. People that are advertising are only going to do this if they see that there is a number of downloads on a regular basis. And realistically, unless you're taking 50,000 downloads on a regular basis, you're not going to make enough money to survive. There's just not enough money in creating advertising to be able to make the podcast go. So there's lots of different models. It all depends on, is this a marketing piece for you? Is this a branding piece for you? Is this a client acquisition piece for you? Is it a way for you to use your podcast to backdoor into finding somebody? There's lots of different ways, that you're going to make money off a podcast, but it's usually not the way that you thought, which is pure advertising.
I like that
Yep.
idea. I think podcasts would be amazing for acquisition scenarios to help with that culture piece, right? Because everyone's just kind of up in turmoil, and the people are often forgotten over, counting always gets integrated, but people just kind of get ignored, right? Those are some really great gems. I really enjoy that creativity about starting a podcast specific to that guy, right?
That's a great story.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But just before we wrap up, what if you could give one tip to improve a company's communication?
One tip to help somebody create their communication: listen better. We all need to learn to listen better.
How would we do that? How do we
listen? We actively have to care about the people we're talking to. We really do. We have to care about the people that we're talking to, and realize that even if we vehemently disagree with their particular point of view, the question is, why do they believe what they believe? come from a position of their beliefs are their beliefs, whether we agree with them or not. They come to the table with a set of beliefs based on their history, their sense of reality, their upbringing, their education, whatever. And if we can sit there and go, okay, I'm not going to be able to get my point across until I understand what their point is. Until you can find that common ground, until you can find that language where we both can speak to each other in a way that we're both listening to each other and we both see each other as valuable and want to be understood, you're never going to get a point across. And that's what we need to do. We need to care about the people we're talking to and see them not as somebody, oh God, you just got to understand. Well, I don't understand what's inside your head. I don't have a USB that I can just plug into your ear, extract the data, throw it into my head and go, oh, I got perfect knowledge. I understand exactly their point of view, and all of the back end history that came along with it. That's just not reality. The only way that we're going to be able to get that across to people is when you can come up with a common language and a common set of understandings. You don't have to agree with them. You just have to be able to create a common language so you're willing to listen to each other.
I like that.
I just have one last question before we close, Ben. If I'm an employee of an organization and I see this, that you create these podcasts and I watch this webinar and I think it's a really cool idea, what do I say to my boss to get him more interested to reach out to you?
I think the best thing to do if you're talking to your boss, saying, look, if we keep doing what we've always done, we're going to keep getting what we got. And the world has changed. We need to look at how can we communicate differently? How can we differentiate ourselves? How can we be more of a partner to our clients and to our employees? And be able to do that, this might be a solution that could help us. And it's at least worth exploring.
Okay. Well, Ben, I really appreciate your time. I so enjoyed chatting with you. See the details to connect with Ben are there. When we post this, we'll obviously throw it in the comments as well, some links. But thank you so much for your time, Ben. And I look forward to your next episode of your podcast.
Hey, thanks for everybody for being. The show is called the Your Living Brand Live show, and it's available anywhere and everywhere that you guys listen to podcasts. Come subscribe. I know I'd love to have you guys part of the journey.